An anonymous letter, an inkblot only Miss Marple can decipher. A party, with deadly consequences. Welcome to Nuis Criminelle. I am your host, Leo. This growing community is amazing. Drop a comment and share where you're tuning in from. It means so much hearing from all of you. I read every single one. Let's dive into the mystery. It was one of those golden afternoons in early July when the hedgerows bristled with bees and the scent of honeysuckle drifted lazily over the lawns. In the charming village of Lower Chipping, the annual St. Edward's Vicarage Garden Party was the social event of the summer. Part charity fundraiser, part battleground for floral competitions and sponge cake supremacy. On the surface, everything appeared idyllic. Children darted between stalls, sticky with jam and excitement, while the elderly gossiped under the bunting-strung tents. Miss Jane Marple, comfortably ensconced in a white-painted deck chair near the rose garden, sipped elderflower cordial and pretended to nod off. In truth, her eyes missed nothing. Behind the main marquee, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Lillian Harper, flitted about with an air of tightly suppressed panic. Her carefully arranged bun threatened collapse, and her voice had acquired the brittle edge of a woman who discovered the lemon curd missing moments before judging. Cressida, for heaven's sake, check the raffle table again. That fountain pen set from Hobbs and Worthington has gone missing. Cressida Blackwood, the new librarian, pale and thin-lipped, straightened her spectacles. I did. Twice. It's not there. She paused. You don't think of someone. Don't be absurd, Mrs. Harper snapped, flushing. This is Lower Chipping, not Whitechapel. Just then, a shrill scream tore through the peaceful air. Everything stopped. Laughter froze mid-chuckle. The string quartet ceased their waltz, and heads turned toward the west lawn, where the croquet pitch lay. Within moments, a crowd gathered at the edge of the yew hedge. There, half crumpled beside the mallet rack, lay the still body of Colonel Geoffrey Summerfield, retired army man, chairman of the local cricket club, and notorious for his opinions on modern morals. His mouth hung open in what looked like surprise, and a jagged, dark blotch spread across the front of his pale linen waistcoat. Mrs. Harper gasped and dropped the basket of raffle tickets. "Oh, my goodness," murmured Miss Marple, rising slowly to her feet and setting down her cordial with delicate precision. "I do believe the Colonel has been murdered." By evening, the garden party had been reduced to a memory of overturned teacups, smeared tartlets, and murmurs that carried like smoke through every parlour and hedgerow in Lower Chipping. The sudden death of Colonel Summerfield had stunned the village not merely for its violence, but for its setting. No one, after all, expected a man to be done in between a tray of cucumber sandwiches and the croquet hoops. The constable arrived within half an hour, panting and red-faced, clearly dismayed at being pulled away from his half-day. Inspector Lennox, summoned from the nearby town of Much Hasley, followed soon after, bringing with him the professional briskness expected of a man who had once handled a burglary ring in Basingstoke. The Colonel's body had been removed under a stiff white sheet, but the stain on the lawn remained, a dark patch visible even beneath the gathering dusk. Miss Marple, standing quietly at the edge of the commotion, observed without interfering. Her expression was mild, her hat straight, and her gloves neatly buttoned. By the next morning, Lower Chipping was a village transformed. The church bell rang not for service, but in solemn recognition of death. Shopkeepers spoke in hushed tones. Bicycles slowed by the vicarage hedge, as though even the croquet lawn held secrets that might suddenly declare themselves. At the greengrocer's, Mrs. Drusilla Goff claimed she had just that morning dreamed of a crow flying into her pantry, a sure sign, she insisted, that death was coming. Young Daniel, the butcher's boy, repeated that the Colonel had received a strange letter only a day prior. He had seen the envelope left on the Colonel's coat at the post office, with an odd inkblot covering half the name. Over tea at the Old Bell Inn, theories abounded. "Heart failure, you mark my words," said Mr. Harold Poole, headmaster of the local grammar school, who insisted upon a rational explanation and dismissed gossip as lower middle-class dramatics. "Poison in the elderflower," muttered Mrs. Tillingham, the postmistress, to anyone within earshot, though I don't discount the idea he finally choked on his own bile. He wasn't what you'd call a charitable sort. "I heard he was having a row with Major Bradstone just last week," offered Elsie Carrow, her eyes gleaming with the pleasure of being overheard. Something about boundary lines and that chestnut tree again. The Major, for his part, denied any quarrel. "Jeff and I had our words," he told Inspector Lennox later that day, "but nothing that warrants, well, this." Miss Marple, meanwhile, spent the morning walking her customary path past the green, stopping for polite conversation where appropriate. She said very little and asked even less. But her gentle eyes noted how Mrs. Harper's gloves were mismatched that morning, how Reverend Harper seemed distracted and oddly silent, and how young Cressida flinched when the word Inkblot was mentioned. It was at the village shop that she ran into Inspector Lennox, who, though not unfriendly, regarded Miss Marple as a well-meaning relic of a bygone age. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," he said, tugging slightly at his hat. "I trust the excitement hasn't been too distressing." "Such things are always distressing," Inspector Miss Marple replied pleasantly, "especially when one knows the deceased. I remember Colonel Summerfield quite well. He once accused a neighbor's cat of communist sympathies. Rather imaginative, really." Lennox gave a tight-lipped smile. "We're investigating thoroughly. There's little to go on as yet. No obvious sign of a struggle. We suspect poison, but we'll have to wait for the pathologist. You wouldn't happen to have noticed anything unusual at the party, would you?" "Oh, my dear boy," Miss Marple said with a faint smile. "I noticed quite a lot of things. But that's the trouble with noticing. Most of it is only useful in hindsight." She adjusted the lavender ribbon on her hat and nodded politely before moving on, leaving Lennox looking slightly deflated. Back at her neat white cottage on Church Lane, Miss Marple settled into her armchair with a small notebook on her lap. She didn't write anything. Not yet. She simply sat, recalling snippets of conversations, subtle glances, and gestures too small to mean anything to anyone but herself. The Colonel's death had not been a crime of passion. It had been quiet, almost invisible. That, she thought, was rather more worrying. Across the village, others were not so reflective. In the drawing-room of Crofton House, the Blackwood sisters, Cressida and her older sibling Rowena, were embroiled in a heated discussion. "It's a tragedy, of course," Rowena was saying, pouring herself a second sherry, "but it's not like the Colonel was universally adored." "He was respected," Cressida said, voice tight. "There's a difference," Rowena snorted. "He was a bully with a title. Do you remember when he tried to have my camellias dug up because they distracted from the historical value of the war memorial?" Cressida didn't answer. Instead, she glanced toward the mantel where a single letter rested beneath the clock. She had not opened it. It had arrived that morning, unmarked except for a single ink blot sealing the flap. Her hands had trembled just holding it. She didn't tell Rowena about the letter. She didn't tell anyone. Elsewhere, Reverend Harper sat in his study with his head bowed, prayer book closed beside him. He whispered a few words, not of scripture, but fragments of sentences. Apologies, perhaps. Regrets. The Reverend had known Colonel Summerfield for over 20 years, but something in his demeanor suggested he was now afraid of what might be uncovered. And in the shadowy corner of the village library, a drawer had been locked with uncharacteristic force. Behind its brass handle sat something curious, a stack of invitation cards, each one identical, save for one detailed black ink blot on the name, smudged deliberately. Only 3 had been sent out, and only one recipient had died. At twilight, the village once again fell into a hush. The cottages exhaled their evening smoke, Curtains were drawn, and doors latched with a little more urgency than usual. Death had a way of making people cautious, even when they had nothing to fear. Or thought they didn't. Miss Marple sat in her parlour, knitting in hand, though her fingers moved, slower than usual. The wool curled over her lap like smoke. Somewhere, a motive stirred behind the mask of civility, and Jane Marple, with her soft eyes and sharper mind, was already beginning to pull at its edges. The morning after the Colonel's death dawned grey and wind-stirred, as though the sky itself sensed something was amiss in Lower Chipping. Dew still clung to the grass, and a hush lingered over the village green as if it were holding its breath. The croquet mallets had been removed. Only the faint blood stain on the lawn, darker now, remained as a stubborn mark on an otherwise civilized affair. Inspector Lennox arrived early at the vicarage, his coat buttoned tightly against the chill. He was met at the door by Mrs. Harper, who looked pale but composed, her manner clipped and efficient. She led him to the sitting-room, where the Colonel's final moments were being endlessly rehashed over cups of tepid tea and cautious sighs. "He simply collapsed," she said for the third time. "We were about to announce the winner of the sponge competition when someone screamed. They didn't even see him fall. He was just on the ground." Lennox made a note. "And he had no known health problems?" He was spry for his age, if a little too fond of brandy. "But no, nothing serious that I knew of." "Was there anyone he argued with recently?" Mrs. Harper hesitated for just a moment. He wasn't exactly popular. She admitted he had a sharp tongue, offended people without meaning to, and some did mean to be offended. Lennox nodded. "We've begun making a list of attendees at the garden party. I assume you can help with that." Mrs. Harper reached for a folder on the writing desk. "Here, the guest list. It includes everyone invited. But you may wish to note," she added, tapping the folder, "a few guests were unexpected. Some arrived without having replied. Anyone in particular?" Her lips pressed into a line. Rowena Blackwood, for one. She hadn't attended a village function in years, and Mr. Mudge, the solicitor from Market Bevington, arrived alone and rather late. He's not even from Lower Chipping. "Interesting," said Lennox. Meanwhile, Miss Marple was already on her own course of investigation of the quieter, more observational kind. She began her day with a visit to the churchyard, ostensibly to tend to the grave of her late nephew's governess, but in truth to pass by the rectory, the post office, and the lane by Crofton House, observing the village in its changed state. She paused to chat with Mr. Weatherby, the gardener, who was pruning the hedge near the Harper residence. "Tragic business, that," he said, wiping his brow. "I was just finishing with the roses when I heard that awful shriek. Thought someone had stepped on a bee." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And you saw nothing?" "No one is acting oddly." Mr. Weatherby paused. "Funny you should ask. I saw young Cressida rushing about the back near the raffle tent, looking flustered. It seemed like she was trying to find something in a hurry." Miss Marple thanked him with a smile and moved on. At the post office, Mrs. Tillingham was in the midst of sorting the previous day's undelivered letters, muttering to herself about rain and the shortcomings of the new stamps. "I was meaning to ask," Miss Marple said mildly, selecting a packet of lavender-scented stationery, "did Colonel Summerfield receive any unusual mail lately?" Mrs. Tillingham paused in her sorting. "Now that you mention it," she said slowly, "he did collect something the morning before the party. A plain envelope. No return address. It looked like thick parchment, very old-fashioned. But he just grunted and shoved it in his coat. Didn't say a word." Miss Marple nodded. "And it had an Inkblot, didn't it?" The postmistress blinked. "Well, yes. A great smudge over his name, like someone spilled a drop from an old pen." "How did you know?" "Oh," Miss Marple replied. "Just something I overheard." It was clear now that the strange invitations were not imaginary, and if her instincts were correct, And they usually were. This inkblot was not a careless accident, but a message. The question was, from whom and why? Back at Crofton House, the Blackwood sisters had retreated into uneasy silence. Cressida had tried to carry on at the library that morning, but returned home early, citing a headache. Rowena, never one for subtlety, pressed her. "Are you quite well? You've been twitching like a guilty housemaid." Cressida looked up, her eyes tired. "It's just the shock, Rowena. He was right there. One moment alive. But you didn't like him. None of us did. So don't pretend it's grief." "It's not," Cressida snapped. Then, more quietly, "It's fear." Rowena frowned. Fear of what? But Cressida said nothing more. At the same time, Inspector Lennox paid a visit to Major Bradstone, who lived in the stone cottage near the village edge, past the cricket field. The Major greeted him with the gruff hospitality of a man who distrusted any authority higher than his own wartime experience. "I've already told you, we had a disagreement about a tree. That's hardly a reason to poison a man. And yet the argument became rather heated, I'm told." The Major poured tea but did not offer any. Summerfield had a way of pushing one's patience. He liked control. It gave him purpose. "Did he seem nervous recently? Distracted?" "Not nervous," said the Major slowly. "But be cautious. A few weeks ago, he asked about the use of dead drops." Lennox blinked. "Dead drops? As in espionage?" "I told you he was a peculiar man," the Major muttered. Lennox took this strange information back to the temporary incident room set up in the village hall. So far, there was no sign of physical struggle, no fingerprints, and no witnesses to anything more than a sudden fall. And yet, Lennox's gut told him this wasn't natural. The lab results on the Colonel's brandy flask retrieved from his coat were still pending, but it was Miss Marple who was, as ever, ahead in quiet inches. Her visit that afternoon was to the library, now empty but for Cressida, who sat behind the desk with a distracted air and a pile of books untouched at her elbow. "Dear Cressida," Miss Marple said gently, "might I borrow something light? I always find Wodehouse rather cheering in grim times." Cressida offered a wan smile. "Top shelf, third aisle, on the right." Miss Marple moved deliberately, passing by the counter, her eyes flicking to the drawer that had been hastily relocked. "You know," she said, without turning, "I once received a letter that had been stained with ink. The sender wanted to conceal something, a name, a date, but in doing so, they revealed far more." Cressida said nothing, but her hand, resting on the counter, curled slowly into a fist. Miss Marple selected her book and returned to the desk. She placed it down gently. "Secrets," she said, "are rather like ink themselves. They tend to seep." She smiled sweetly, took her book, and left, her departure as quiet as her arrival. Evening settled over Lower Chipping once again. A second letter had been sent, and Miss Marple suspected there would be more. By Wednesday morning, the village of Lower Chipping had settled into a peculiar rhythm of speculation and unease. The murder of Colonel Summerfield, though not officially declared as such, hung heavily in every lane, shop, and drawing room. Faces were watchful. Conversations were clipped. Even the bird-song seemed hesitant. The inquest had yet to be formally scheduled, but Inspector Lennox had begun to establish a narrative. With no clear signs of trauma and no witnesses to any overt act of violence, he leaned toward poison, specifically something quick-acting, concealed in the Colonel's flask or tea. As the pathologist's initial report trickled in, his suspicion seemed confirmed. A compound derived from foxglove, most likely digitalis, had been found in the Colonel's bloodstream. A common enough substance in certain medicinal tinctures, but lethal in sufficient quantity. Now the inspector needed motive, means, and opportunity. The first name on his list was Rowena Blackwood. She had, after all, arrived uninvited. She had a known history of clashing with the colonel over a land dispute that had grown into a long-standing village feud. Worse, her presence at the garden party had coincided precisely with the period in which the flask was believed to have been tampered with. Inspector Lennox visited Crofton House once more and found Rowena in her conservatory, pruning a pot of drooping azaleas with surgical precision. "I suppose you've come to accuse me of something ghastly," she said without looking up. "How thrilling." "I've come to ask questions, Miss Blackwood," Lennox replied, unamused, "about your relationship with the deceased." Rowena set down her pruning shears and straightened up. Geoffrey Summerfield was a pompous old windbag with a cane and an overinflated sense of civic duty. He disapproved of everything: my gardens, my guests, my fashion choices, and most certainly my sister. "You didn't receive an invitation to the garden party?" "No," she replied, "I most certainly did not." "I went to accompany Cressida. She gets so pale in crowds. I'm her sister, not her keeper, but I like to think I make things bearable." Lennox scribbled something in his notebook. "You weren't near the refreshments table?" "I was near the rose tent when the screaming started." "Ask Mrs. Carter. She was rambling on about her grandson's scholarship and the colonel's flask. Did you see it?" Rowena raised an eyebrow. "I wouldn't touch that man's personal effects with tongs. He smelled like mothballs and tobacco. Besides, who carries a flask to a garden party? Desperation, I suppose." Lennox made no reply. But as he stood to leave, Rowena added, almost idly, "Of course, you might ask who had access to the raffle prizes. The pen set went missing, didn't it? Rather odd, that." The inspector paused in the doorway. "What do you mean?" "Oh, just that it disappeared shortly before the colonel did. Funny how people focus on one crime and forget another may already have happened." Lennox nodded, thoughtful. That same afternoon, Miss Marple hosted her usual Thursday knitting circle, though the conversation was far from usual. Only 3 ladies attended: Mrs. Bantry, Miss Allerton, and young Kitty Price, who had recently returned from 2 years in Canada and was thrilled by the presence of a real English scandal. "Do you think it was deliberate?" Kitty asked, her knitting lying in her lap, untouched. "Poison, I mean." Miss Marple's needles clicked gently. If it were accidental, it would have to be remarkably coincidental. Poison, especially one such as digitalis, requires careful preparation. "I heard the vicar looked rather unwell afterward," Miss Allerton whispered. "Perhaps he knows more than he's saying." Miss Marple said nothing, but noted the comment with quiet interest. She had observed Reverend Harper looking drawn and distant, as if his mind were turning over a private burden. The conversation turned, as it always did, toward village politics and small scandals. Mrs. Tillingham's new coat, the curious absence of Mr. Mudge from the village since the party, and whether the baker's assistant was perhaps too familiar with the butcher's daughter. But underneath the chatter, a current of tension hummed. When the ladies had gone, Miss Marple sat alone in the parlor. She stared at the fire, her knitting forgotten, a distant look in her eyes. Something in Rowena's tone had bothered her, something too controlled, too rehearsed. But it wasn't Rowena she thought about most. It was Cressida. At the library the next morning, Miss Marple returned her borrowed Wodehouse and requested a volume on medicinal plants. Cressida, visibly weary, fetched it without a word. Her hands trembled slightly. "You must be exhausted, dear," Miss Marple said gently. "This whole affair is quite a strain." Cressida gave a small, rueful smile. "I suppose I am. It's just that the colonel was a cruel man. People feared him. But now that he's gone, I can't tell if I feel relief or guilt." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Did you fear him, Cressida?" The librarian hesitated. "No," she whispered. "But I feared what he knew." Miss Marple let that sit for a moment before changing the subject with impeccable timing. "Have you ever handled digitalis, dear?" I recall your mother kept a garden full of foxgloves. Cressida looked startled. Not since I was a girl. Mother used to make tinctures, but she stopped after father fell ill. Said it wasn't safe. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Later that day, Inspector Lennox gathered a group of possible witnesses in the village hall for a formal questioning session. The tension in the air was palpable. Reverend Harper, Rowena Blackwood, Mrs. Harper, and Cressida sat in a line of chairs beneath a faded Union Jack and a framed photograph of Queen Mary. I'm going to ask each of you to describe your movements. The hour before Colonel Summerfield collapsed, Lennox announced. Please keep your answers simple and truthful. One by one, they gave their accounts. The Reverend had been preparing his brief speech on behalf of the charity fund. Mrs. Harper had been coordinating the raffle. Rowena reiterated her location by the rose tent. Cressida claimed she was sorting books for the second-hand stall and retrieving prizes for the drawing. And were you near the refreshments? Lennox asked her directly. Cressida's eyes flicked to her sister, then back, only briefly. I helped Mrs. Carter retrieve a misplaced basket. I wasn't near the Colonel. Afterwards, Lennox remained unconvinced. He shared his doubts with Miss Marple that evening, walking slowly along the green as the sun lowered behind the church spire. They all have reason to lie, he muttered. Rowena is defiant. Cressida is frightened. The vicar looks as though he's drowning in his own conscience. And Mrs. Harper? She's a chess player. Every word is deliberate. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes, the most revealing lies are the small ones, the ones told not to deceive, but to protect. She glanced up toward the path leading to Crofton House. I believe the first suspect is not necessarily the true one, Inspector, but they may still hold a part of the truth. And as the bells of St. Edward's tolled for the evening hour, the wind carried with it the faint rustle of secrets not yet spoken. The village awoke to a heavy mist that Friday morning, softening edges and blurring outlines as if lower chipping itself wished to obscure the truth. The grey tendrils curled around garden gates and the iron fences of the vicarage, muffling the usual clatter of milk pails and bicycle bells. The events of the past days hung on every doorstep like the mist, unwelcome, unshakable, and cold. At the village hall, Inspector Lennox sifted through a box of items collected from the crime scene. There was the Colonel's flask, now carefully sealed and tagged, a pair of leather gloves, a program for the afternoon schedule, and finally, a crumpled envelope that had initially seemed inconsequential. It had been found beneath a chair near the croquet lawn. The envelope was addressed to Colonel Summerfield in a shaky hand, and though the ink was smudged, one detail stood out clearly now in the morning light, a single blot of ink, a dark splash across the Colonel's name, not from mishandling but carefully placed, almost like a signature. Lennox held it up to the light, his brows knitting. "What are you trying to tell me?" he murmured aloud. He hadn't noticed Miss Marple entering the hall. She was as quiet as she was precise, her soft-soled shoes giving no warning as she approached. "Ah," she said mildly, "you found the invitation." Lennox turned. "Invitation?" Miss Marple gave a nod. "Yes, there were 3 of them, I believe. Old-fashioned paper, slightly yellowed at the edges. Identical save for the name and one rather distinctive inkblot. It's more than a stain. It's a mark of concealment. Whoever sent those letters was hiding something in plain sight." Lennox studied the envelope more closely. "I'll admit it didn't seem important at first, but I'm beginning to think it may be the most telling clue of all." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, looking pleased. "You see, the inkblot wasn't clumsy. It was deliberate, like someone trying to obscure a piece of handwriting, perhaps even their own." Lennox looked up. "Do you think it was forged?" "Oh, no," Miss Marple said. "Nothing so dramatic. I suspect the letters were genuine in their intent, only disguised so the sender could remain anonymous." She paused. There is something very human, Inspector, about the attempt to conceal identity through partial truth. That is why I think it is time we visited Mr. Mudge, from Market Bevington, the solicitor." Lennox raised an eyebrow. Miss Marple nodded. "He was at the party, though he had no business being there, and I believe he may be connected to these invitations, if not the murder itself." That afternoon, Lennox and Miss Marple paid a visit to the solicitor's modest offices above the haberdashers in Market Bevington. The place was cramped and slightly musty, with ledgers stacked like unstable towers and a dusty brass plaque reading "Hubert Mudge, Estates and Wills." Mr. Mudge, a gaunt man with a pointed beard and fingers stained with ink, greeted them nervously. "I heard about the colonel," he said, offering a limp handshake. "Terrible, terrible business. I was just at the party for a few minutes, didn't stay long." "You didn't receive an invitation?" Lennox asked. Mudge blinked. No, I was delivering something." "For Miss Blackwood?" "For Rowena or Cressida?" Miss Marple asked, watching him closely. Mudge hesitated. "Rowena." "Interesting," she said gently. "Because Miss Blackwood mentioned nothing about a delivery. What was it?" "A personal matter," he said too quickly. "Legal papers." "What kind of legal papers?" Mudge shifted in his chair, then opened a drawer and removed a folded document. He handed it to Lennox. "It's an addendum to a will, Colonel Summerfield's, in fact." Lennox frowned, reading quickly. "This document names Cressida Blackwood as the sole beneficiary of his personal effects and a sum of £3,000. Miss Marple's eyes flickered, but her tone remained even. "And when was this drawn up?" "Just 3 weeks ago," Mudge said, his voice low. He was very particular. He said the girl had been of help to him, typing, organizing papers, that sort of thing. Lennox looked sharply at Miss Marple. "A motive, then. But why keep it quiet?" Miss Marple spoke carefully, because the colonel knew his bequest would raise eyebrows. Perhaps he feared it might seem improper. The solicitor shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing more. As they walked back through the high street, Lennox was quiet. "So," he said at last, "the shy librarian had everything to gain. Financial motive, opportunity, access." Miss Marple nodded. "It seems so. But the presence of motive is not proof of guilt." Still, Lennox said, "I think I should question her again, and more formally this time." That evening, as dusk fell over Lower Chipping, Miss Marple visited the vicarage. She brought with her a jar of raspberry preserves and a quiet air of concern. Reverend Harper ushered her into the sitting room, his face drawn and his hands clasped tightly. "You've heard," he said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Cressida. She came to me yesterday," the Reverend said. "In confidence. I don't feel it is my place to share everything. But Jane, she's frightened. Not of the police, but of what will be revealed." Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. "Secrets, Reverend, are like thorns. Left buried, they fester." He sighed. Geoffrey Summerfield wasn't a kind man. He used what he knew to exert control. He often recorded private conversations. Letters, too. He kept them. "Blackmail?" Miss Marple asked softly. The vicar hesitated. He wouldn't have called it that. But yes, people owed him things. Silence, mainly. Did Cressida owe him something? "She believes she did," he said. "There was a family matter. Nothing criminal, but compromising. The colonel offered to make it disappear in exchange for certain favors. And yet he changed his will in her favor," Miss Marple murmured. "Perhaps he had a change of heart. Or perhaps he was playing a deeper game." When she returned home that night, Miss Marple sat in her parlor and opened her own notebook. She wrote 3 names on the page: Cressida, Rowena, and Reverend Harper. Then, below them, a single word: fear. Each of them was afraid of something. Each had reason to hate the colonel. But hatred alone did not kill. It required planning, opportunity, and above all, nerve. And as the embers died in the fireplace, Miss Marple remembered something she had seen the day of the garden party. A movement, a glance, a hand placed precisely on a tray that had not belonged to the speaker. A small thing, but it stayed with her. She reached for her knitting once more and began to work, her hands moving steadily. Sometimes it was the smallest clue that unraveled the largest lies. The mist had lifted by Saturday morning, but the sense of foreboding remained. It clung to the edges of teacups and hung in the stillness of conversation, as though the very air was listening. The Colonel's funeral had been scheduled for Monday, but talk of mourning was overshadowed by whispers of arrest. People watched each other now, quietly, carefully wondering who had known what and when. At the heart of this quiet storm was Cressida Blackwood. Word of the Colonel's altered will had travelled swiftly, as such things always did in small villages. While no one said it aloud, the implication hovered just beyond the edge of every sentence. Cressida had something to gain and perhaps something to hide. Her walks to the library became shorter, her glances more furtive. Even her posture had changed. Gone was the upright, quietly dignified librarian. In her place stood a woman who looked hunted. Miss Marple, however, remained calm. On Saturday afternoon she took tea with Mrs. Bantry at the Old Bell Inn, selecting a corner table with a view of the High Street. The tea-room buzzed with carefully measured conversations, none so loud as to be improper, yet all loaded with innuendo. Mrs. Bantry, whose love of gossip was only matched by her loyalty to Miss Marple, leaned in with a conspiratorial gleam in her eyes. "I was just speaking with that horrid Mrs. Tillingham," she began. "She claims she saw Rowena Blackwood slipping something into the rubbish bin behind the raffle tent, just after the Colonel collapsed." Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. "Did she say what Rowena discarded?" "Number only that it looked like an envelope, crumpled, with a blot of ink." "Another invitation?" Miss Marple asked softly. Mrs. Bantry blinked. "You think there were more?" "I believe so," Miss Marple replied. "And I believe each recipient was chosen very precisely. A select few who shared something they hoped never to see the light of day." The next stop on Miss Marple's quiet pilgrimage was Crofton House. She arrived with a basket of quince jelly and a smile as gentle as the afternoon breeze. Rowena answered the door herself. "Jane Marple," she said dryly, "I rather thought you'd be alone sooner." "I do try not to disappoint," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "May I come in?" Rowena stood aside, leading her into a drawing-room that looked untouched by grief. The furniture was immaculate, the cushions precisely fluffed, and the fire set but unlit. It had the feel of a place preserved rather than lived in. "I won't offer tea," Rowena said. "You're not here for it." "No," Miss Marple said, placing her gloves neatly in her lap. "I'm here because I believe you've been hiding something. Not necessarily a crime, but a truth." Rowena sat back, arms crossed. "Do go on." "You didn't come to the garden party just to accompany your sister," Miss Marple said. "You came to confront the Colonel. About something in writing, perhaps something he had on you." Rowena's face remained composed, but a muscle in her jaw twitched. "You're remarkably perceptive for someone who pretends not to listen." "Oh, I listen very well," Miss Marple replied. "For instance, I heard from Mr. Mudge that you had legal dealings with the Colonel weeks before his death, and I heard from Mrs. Tillingham that you discarded something behind the tents, something with ink on it." Rowena exhaled slowly. "He threatened to expose me," she said at last. "Years ago, during the war, I corresponded with a man in Lisbon. He was never officially charged, but there were whispers that he was selling information. Nothing ever came of it. It was a youthful indiscretion, nothing more. But Geoffrey kept the letters. He used them to keep me quiet when I challenged him on the land boundary. So when you received the letter with the inkblot, I knew it was him, or someone acting for him. He was summoning me, testing me. And yes, I went, but I didn't kill him. Miss Marple nodded. I believe you. Rowena looked surprised. You do? You may be many things, Miss Blackwood, Miss Marple said. But subtle is not one of them. Poisoning someone in public does not suit your style. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the village, Miss Marple took a slow walk to the vicarage. The Reverend greeted her with a weary smile. I rather thought you'd be out solving this puzzle, he said. I find the pieces arrange themselves when left alone long enough, Miss Marple replied. They sat in the study, the ticking clock marking each moment with quiet inevitability. She came again today, Reverend Harper said after a pause. Cressida. She asked if it was a sin to feel free. Miss Marple looked at him gently. Did you tell her it was? No, he said, his voice rough. But I fear she believes she's guilty nonetheless. Guilt is not always tied to wrongdoing, Miss Marple said. Sometimes it is tied to silence. She rose and walked to the bookshelf, running her hand along the spines. She's hiding something, of course. But I don't think it's murder. Reverend Harper said nothing, but his gaze lingered on a photograph above the mantel, his wife Lillian smiling beside the colonel, a frozen moment from last year's fete. She was fond of him, he said quietly. Your wife? Yes. They had an understanding. Miss Marple turned. Do you believe she could have acted against him? He shook his head slowly. Lillian is capable of many things. Pettiness, pride, manipulation. But not murder. Still, Miss Marple said, I must ask to speak with her. That conversation took place the following morning in the vicarage garden, where Lillian Harper was trimming deadheads from the roses with clinical precision. Mrs. Harper, Miss Marple began, do you recall when the fountain pen set went missing? I do, Lillian replied briskly. It vanished shortly before the raffle began. A great embarrassment. It was one of the most valuable items, Miss Marple said, and the one item the colonel was particularly interested in winning. Lillian paused in her pruning. You believe it was taken deliberately? I believe it was exchanged, Miss Marple said. The box that was returned after the party was lighter than it had been. The pen had been replaced with a common one. Lillian looked up. You think someone used the pen to poison the flask? No, Miss Marple said. I think the pen was a lure, and the person who took it believed it held something else. Perhaps a document, perhaps a letter, but in the confusion they left behind more than they knew. Lillian's shears snapped shut. I don't appreciate being interrogated in my own garden, and I don't enjoy watching good people shoulder guilt that doesn't belong to them, Miss Marple replied. You were once in possession of one of those inkblot letters, weren't you? Lillian's lips thinned. He sent it to me the week before the party. It said only, come, or others will know. So you went, like the others. I was tired of being controlled, Lillian said, but I didn't kill him. As Miss Marple left the vicarage, the fog in her mind began to clear. The truth, like a nearly complete jigsaw puzzle, was beginning to show its picture. 3 invitations, 3 secrets, 3 motives, but only 1 killer. And somewhere, hidden in the folds of what had already been said, Miss Marple had seen the clue that would bring the whole thing to light. Sunday morning brought a strange kind of silence to Lower Chipping. The bells of St. Edward's rang out across the village green, their tones clear and solemn, but few answered the call. Those who did arrive for the morning service wore expressions less of reverence than of distraction. Heads turned subtly as Cressida Blackwood entered alone, her eyes cast downward, her dress plainer than usual. Reverend Harper gave the sermon, but even he seemed unfocused, fumbling his readings and losing the rhythm of his speech. The congregation murmured its responses dutifully but without spirit. There was an unspoken understanding among them now, one that weighed heavier than Scripture. Someone among them had taken a life, and everyone had a theory. Miss Marple, seated 3 rows from the front with a neat handbag on her lap and her usual expression of calm interest, did not join the speculation. She watched instead. Not the pulpit, not the stained glass windows, but the people. How they shifted in their seats, who looked at whom, and who avoided eye contact entirely. It was just after the final hymn when the twist arrived, not from the heavens, but from a breathless figure hurrying up the center aisle. It was Daniel, the butcher's boy. He paused by the item. Reverend sighed, whispered something urgently, and handed him an envelope. There was a ripple through the church as Reverend Harper opened it. His face paled as he read. "This is most unexpected," he said, turning toward the congregation. "It appears there has been another incident. A collective breath was held. Mrs. Carter has been taken gravely ill at her home. Dr. Millworth is with her now." Miss Marple closed her handbag quietly. Outside the church, the crowd began to gather in clusters. "Poison again?" asked Mrs. Goff in a scandalized whisper. "She was at the garden party, too," murmured Miss Allerton. "And didn't she help serve the drinks?" added Kitty Price, eyes wide. By midday, the news had spread. Mrs. Carter, beloved organizer of the flower competition and lifelong member of the Women's Guild, had collapsed in her drawing room shortly after tea. Her housemaid had found her unconscious beside a half-finished cup and a letter with a familiar smear of ink. Another Inkblot invitation. Miss Marple arrived at the Carter residence as Dr. Millworth was emerging from the parlor, a grim expression on his face. "She's stable for now," he said. "But there's no mistaking it as digital. Same as Colonel Summerfield." "And the letter?" asked Miss Marple. The doctor shook his head. "Burned in the fireplace. Only half of it survived, but enough to identify the blot." "Did she mention anything before she collapsed?" "Only one word. Forgive." Miss Marple entered the drawing room. It was as tastefully fussy as one might expect, lace curtains, porcelain cats, and framed photographs of long-departed relatives. But it was the half-burned letter that caught her attention. She knelt beside the hearth and carefully extracted what remained. A corner of parchment, browned at the edges, with a single flourish of ink. The blot was the same shape as a falling feather. She turned to the housemaid, a girl named Elsie, who stood wringing her hands near the door. "Did Mrs. Carter receive any visitors this morning?" "Just Miss Cressida, ma'am," Elsie said. "Came by just after breakfast. Brought some books and a jar of plum jam." "Did she stay long?" "No more than 10 minutes." Miss Marple's face remained placid, but inside her mind was racing. Cressida, again. Outside, Inspector Lennox had arrived, clearly summoned with urgency. He nodded curtly at Miss Marple. "This changes things," he said. "Same poison, same method." And another Inkblot letter. If Cressida visited both victims just before their collapses, Miss Marple held up a gloved hand. She also visited the vicarage this week, and the library, and Mrs. Harper, and the school. She is the village librarian, after all. "Still," Lennox said, "she's now connected to both poisonings." "Connected, yes. But causality is not so tidy," Miss Marple replied. "Tell me, Inspector, has anyone else received an Inkblot letter recently? Anyone still alive?" Lennox glanced around. "Not that I'm aware of." "Then you'll want to check the desk drawers of a few more villagers," Miss Marple said, and turned away without waiting for agreement. That afternoon, the entire village seemed to lean toward chaos. Speculation became accusation. Rowena Blackwood's name was once again on every tongue. Her sharpness, her defiance, her sudden reappearance at the garden party, none of it sat right with the villagers. "She hated the colonel," murmured one voice. "She probably coached her sister." "I'd not put murder past a Blackwood," said a third. Even Reverend Harper, once a bastion of balance, seemed unsure of where to place his trust. His sermon that evening was cancelled, and the vicarage curtains remained drawn. At Crofton House, Cressida sat trembling in her reading chair, the fireplace cold and her hands curled around a worn copy of Hardy's The Woodlanders. Rowena stood at the window, arms folded. "You can't keep doing this," Rowena said flatly. "Running about, dropping jam jars and books and letters. Do you know what they're saying now?" Cressida didn't look up. I tried to help her. "Mrs. Carter. She was so kind to me when I was little. I never meant—" "But you went. You went after you got that letter, didn't you?" Cressida finally looked at her sister. "So did you. So did half the village." "Yes, but we're not being blamed." "You are. And you're making it worse by skulking about like a guilty cat." Rowena turned, eyes fierce. "If you've done something, if you've said something you shouldn't, now is the time to tell me." Cressida stood, voice shaking. "I didn't kill anyone, but I know who might have." Rowena froze. "What do you mean?" Cressida moved to the writing desk and unlocked the top drawer. From inside, she pulled out a letter. Her hands were steady now. "He sent this to me 3 days before he died." The colonel. Not the first letter, a second one. This one said, "If you do not act, someone else will, and you will be next." Rowena snatched it from her, scanning it quickly. "And you didn't think to show anyone?" "I was scared," Cressida said softly. "I thought he was bluffing." But now, Mrs. Carter. She didn't finish. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat by the fire in her parlour, a pot of chamomile tea at her side and her knitting untouched on the table. She had spent the afternoon tracing paths across the village, revisiting small places and re-asking quiet questions. She had spoken to Elsie again, to Dr. Millworth, even to the grocer's wife, who had noticed something curious in the refuse bins behind the vicarage, an empty medicine bottle with no label. And now, as night folded itself gently over Lower Chipping, Miss Marple understood. It was not about the poison alone, nor the Inkblot letters. It was about timing, about someone who used the colonel's own manipulations against him, someone clever enough to send out letters in his style, someone who knew where to find digitalis, someone who could walk unnoticed through parlours, drawing rooms and gardens, a person who understood fear because they lived among it. The killer, she now believed, had struck twice, but the second time had not gone according to plan, and that misstep, however small, would be their undoing. By Monday morning, the village was gripped by a peculiar kind of paralysis. No one ventured out unnecessarily, and those who did kept their eyes fixed on the pavement, nodding briskly if they passed a familiar face. The impending funeral of Colonel Summerfield only added to the tension. The sense that something unfinished loomed over the village made every whisper sound sharper, every knock on a door feel heavier. Miss Marple, however, moved with purpose. She had slept little, though her face showed no sign of fatigue. Instead, she carried a calmness that seemed to settle the air around her. She took tea at her usual time, straightened the cushions on her sitting-room armchair, and placed a small envelope into her handbag. Then she went to the vicarage. Reverend Harper greeted her at the door with an expression torn between curiosity and worry. The funeral was to begin in less than 2 hours, and already black-suited mourners had begun arriving along the path to the church. "Jane," he said, stepping aside, "I didn't expect you this early." "I hoped we might have a quiet word before the day unfolds," Miss Marple said gently. "Something has been troubling me. He nodded, leading her to the drawing-room where Lillian Harper stood near the window, adjusting her hat in the reflection of the glass. She turned with polite surprise when Miss Marple entered. "Miss Marple?" she said. "What brings you here today?" "I thought perhaps," said Miss Marple, placing her handbag delicately on the side table, "we might discuss something privately." "Something delicate." Lillian stiffened, but the Reverend gestured for her to stay. Miss Marple withdrew the envelope from her bag and held it out. "This came to my door this morning. No address, no stamp. Slipped through my letterbox. I wonder, Mrs. Harper, if you would recognize the handwriting." Lillian took it, hesitating before opening it. Inside was a single sheet, folded once. She read it in silence. Her hand trembled. It read, "You saw too much. Keep quiet or join the others." "I don't know this writing," she said, her voice unsteady. "I've never seen it before." Reverend Harper leaned in, reading over her shoulder. "This is a threat," he muttered. "Someone is still trying to frighten others. Or someone is hoping I'll react publicly," Miss Marple said mildly. "A final warning, perhaps. A push to silence someone before the funeral." She took the letter back and folded it neatly. "There's something I'd like to try. A little test, if you will." Lillian looked uneasy. "What kind of test? One that might finally tell us who's behind the Inkblot letters and the murders?" Later that morning, just before the funeral was due to begin, Miss Marple returned to the church with an expression of innocent purpose. She greeted those gathered with gentle nods, her demeanor unchanged. Inside, the pews were nearly full. At the front, the colonel's coffin sat beneath a simple spray of lilies, a Union Jack draped across it. The air was thick with perfume, damp wool, and unsaid things. Inspector Lennox sat 2 rows from the back, watching everything, notebook in hand. Cressida and Rowena were seated together, though with space between them. Lillian Harper sat alone, gloves tightly clutched in her lap. Miss Marple took a seat in the middle pew, waited for the congregation to still, and then rose. "Before the service begins," she said gently, her voice just loud enough to carry, "I must beg everyone's pardon. I've received a letter bearing a familiar mark." She withdrew the folded paper from her bag and held it up. "There have been several letters, all marked with a curious ink blot. You may recall hearing about them. They seem to connect those who received them to the deaths of Colonel Summerfield and, more recently, the attempt on Mrs. Carter." A murmur moved through the room like wind through dry grass. "I have invited those who received such letters to join me here today, and I have brought one more with me." She opened the letter and read it aloud. "You saw too much. Keep quiet or join the others." Lillian Harper shifted in her seat. Rowena straightened. Cressida looked stricken. Miss Marple folded the letter again and turned to face the altar. "What is most curious," she continued, "is that each letter was hand-delivered, not posted, slipped through doors or left among personal effects. That suggests not only familiarity with our habits, but also boldness. The killer must have known where to strike, when to drop these messages, and whom to threaten." She paused. "And of course, they must have access to the means." From the rear of the church, a hush had fallen. "I had a theory," Miss Marple said quietly, "but I needed one more reaction. One more glance, one more confirmation." Her eyes moved from face to face. "And I believe I now know the truth." Inspector Lennox stood, but Miss Marple raised a hand. "Please, allow me just another moment." She turned to face the front row. "Cressida Blackwood." Cressida froze. "You received a second letter," Miss Marple said. "One that warned you someone else might act if you did not. You assumed it came from Colonel Summerfield, but the timing was all wrong. He was already dead when it arrived." Cressida's lips parted. "But how could that be?" "Because he didn't write it," Miss Marple said. "None of them came from him. They came from someone who knew his handwriting well enough to imitate it and who wanted to frighten people into silence. Someone who needed to clean up a series of risks. She turned. Lillian Harper. Gasps echoed through the church. Lillian stood slowly, her expression oddly serene. "I don't know what you're implying," she said. "I believe you wrote the Inkblot letters," Miss Marple said. "I believe you knew of the Colonel's secrets because he shared them with you. You were closer to him than many realized, and when he altered his will, leaving his possessions and funds to Cressida, you saw your control slipping away." Miss Marple's voice remained soft and measured. "You had access to digitalis from the vicarage's medicinal stores. You hosted the garden party, planned the raffle, and coordinated the serving of refreshments. You saw Colonel Summerfield take his drink and knew when he'd reach for the flask." Lillian said nothing. "But it was the second letter to Cressida that betrayed you," Miss Marple continued. "A letter only someone alive and active after the Colonel's death could have sent. You hoped to frighten her into isolation, perhaps even suicide. When that failed, you tried again, this time with Mrs. Carter, another woman who once stood between you and the Colonel's affections." Lillian's hands were trembling now. "I was trying to fix what he broke," she whispered. "He ruined people, hold things over them. Secrets. My husband never knew what Geoffrey was capable of." Reverend Harper stood, pale and shaken. "Lillian, is it true?" Miss Marple turned to Inspector Lennox. "I believe you'll find the original invitations in her bureau, hidden beneath the drawer lining. Inkblots carefully applied. The fountain pen replaced in the raffle box was used only once before she switched it." Lennox stepped forward, gently taking Lillian's arm. She didn't resist. As the congregation began to murmur and stir, Miss Marple sat down again, folding her hands in her lap. The coffin remained at the front, still and silent. But the village, for the first time in days, exhaled. There had been another twist, and now there would be another reckoning. Outside the church, the sky was a wash of pale gray, neither gloomy nor bright, in between shades that mirrored the mood in Lower Chipping. News of Lillian Harper's quiet confession spread faster than a brush fire. The villagers who had gathered for Colonel Summerfield's funeral found themselves witnessing a different kind of burial, the unearthing of a long-concealed truth. The service was delayed, of course. Reverend Harper, shaken beyond words, left the altar without completing the readings. The coffin remained where it had been placed, its presence now strangely less commanding. The congregation drifted outside in subdued groups, their voices hushed, their thoughts turbulent. Inside the church, Miss Marple remained seated, her gaze fixed on the altar rail, as though in silent conversation with it. Her presence radiated calm, even as others struggled to process the morning's revelations. Inspector Lennox, standing just inside the entrance, folded his notebook and slipped it into his coat pocket. He approached Miss Marple with a mixture of awe and residual disbelief. "You were certain," he said quietly, "and yet you waited." "I had to," Miss Marple replied, rising slowly to her feet. "Truth stated without proof is only gossip." I needed her reaction. "The letter I read aloud. Well, I'm afraid it was my own fabrication." Lennox blinked. "You forged it?" "Only in the mildest sense," she said with a smile. "It was an imitation of the previous threats. Enough to provoke a response. And provoke it." They stepped out into the courtyard together, the wind gently lifting the edge of Miss Marple's hat. Lennox sighed. Still difficult to believe. Lillian Harper, the vicar's wife, the woman who arranged church flowers and organized bake sales. Miss Marple nodded, and yet entirely believable when viewed through the lens of motive and opportunity. Lillian's relationship with Colonel Summerfield was complicated. I don't believe it was a love affair. It was more a mutual understanding, a sort of alliance built on secrets. He needed someone who knew the village, its rhythms, and its habits. and she needed someone who made her feel powerful. She used that knowledge to send the letters, Lennox asked. She did. Not all at once, mind you. She observed who the colonel had leverage over, Rowena, Cressida, and Mrs. Carter, and when she saw that his death hadn't broken their silence, she acted to maintain control. Lennox shook his head. Poisoning one man is evil. Trying again to silence a woman who'd done no harm, that's something else. Desperation, Miss Marple said. The colonel's request to Cressida was unexpected. It shifted the dynamic. I imagine Lillian saw that as a betrayal and final insult. When people live on the edge of power, even a small loss can feel like a collapse. As they walked down the path leading away from the church, the bells remained silent behind them. It was no longer a day for mourning, but for reckoning. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple returned to her cottage. She hung her coat neatly, placed her gloves in the drawer by the door, and brewed a fresh pot of Darjeeling. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that comes only after something heavy has passed through. She sat in her favorite armchair, surrounded by soft chintz and the comforting smell of old wood and lavender. The events of the last few days played across her mind, not with pride or satisfaction, but with gentle resolve. She thought of Cressida, whose quiet fear had almost swallowed her, and Rowena, who had fought shadows of her past, only to be unfairly caught in the web of suspicion, of Reverend Harper, now left with the echo of betrayal in his own home, and Mrs. Carter, who would recover but never quite forget the sensation of poison seeping into her limbs. Each had been drawn into a net spun, not by madness, but by a deeply human need, the need to protect, to control, to survive. A knock at the door broke her reverie. When she answered, she found Cressida standing on the step, holding a small paper-wrapped bundle. "I thought you might like these," Cressida said shyly. "They're just scones. From Rowena's recipe. She's not much for thank you, but, well, we both owe you." Miss Marple smiled and accepted the bundle with both hands. "Come in, dear," she said. "I have tea already steeping." Cressida stepped inside, visibly more at ease than she had been in days. The cottage enveloped her like a warm shawl, and she sat where Miss Marple indicated, tucking her hands into her lap. "I wanted to tell you," she said after a pause, "about the letter. The second one. When I realized it had come after the colonel's death, I thought maybe I was going mad. Or maybe someone was trying to make me feel mad. You weren't wrong," Miss Marple said. "Just misled. That's how such people operate. They twist the truth until it loses its shape. I kept thinking," Cressida continued, "that if I said something, I'd be the next to go. But staying quiet felt just as dangerous." "It often does," Miss Marple said. "But in the end, silence only protects the wrong people." They sat in companionable quiet for a few moments as the tea cooled and the late afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains. "Do you think she really meant to kill Mrs. Carter?" Cressida asked at last. "No," Miss Marple replied. "I believe it was a mistake. Lillian meant to frighten her, as she did with you. A few drops, enough to cause confusion or illness. But digitalis is unforgiving. Even a small miscalculation can become deadly. Will she go to prison?" Miss Marple gave a quiet nod. "Inspector Lennox will do his duty," she confessed. "There will be a trial. And the Reverend." Miss Marple's expression softened. "He's a good man, Cressida. He will carry this burden with dignity. But he will be changed. We all are after something like this." Cressida looked down at her hands. "I always thought the village was a safe place, that things like this only happened in cities, in novels." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Wickedness, dear, is not a matter of geography. It blooms wherever the soil is right, but so, too, does kindness." As twilight deepened and the church bell finally tolled the hour of vespers, Miss Marple rose to refresh the tea. Outside, the village was slowly beginning to breathe again. Curtains that had remained closed for days were drawn back. The grocer's bell rang as someone entered for eggs. Children's voices drifted across the green. Life, as it always does, has begun to return. But it would not be quite the same. There would be one fewer chair at the Women's Guild. One more name spoken carefully, behind gloved hands. A new wariness in the way people greeted one another. In time, the garden party would resume. New secrets would root themselves in hedgerows and behind net curtains. But the memory of the Inkblot invitations would linger. And in her sitting room, Miss Marple would continue her knitting, each stitch a small act of understanding. She had once again peeled back the layers of human nature and found the truth inside. Not for glory, not for acclaim, but because someone must always watch, must always see. And Jane Marple had seen. It was nearly a week since the events at Colonel Summerfield's funeral, and the village of Lower Chipping, like a shaken snow globe finally settling, had begun to return to something like normal. The routines that had been interrupted, the bell-ringing schedules, the WI baking rota, and the Thursday bridge nights resumed one by one with only the subtlest adjustments. But those with sharper instincts noticed the difference. People walked with more deliberation now. Conversations paused just a moment longer before resuming. Trust, once assumed in Lower Chipping, had become something to be cautiously extended, not freely given. The Inkblot invitations were still discussed in lowered voices, and though Lillian Harper had been escorted to Much Hasley to await a formal inquiry and trial, the vicarage retained a ghostly stillness. Reverend Harper carried on with his duties, but with a new solemnity. His sermons had grown quieter and more introspective. Parishioners spoke kindly of him, but their glances carried concern. A man's belief in his work could steady many things. But the betrayal of love left deeper, unseen wounds. At the library, Cressida Blackwood had returned to her post. Slowly, then steadily. Her movements no longer twitched with dread, though she still avoided eye contact for too long, and her hands, always so precisely, occasionally trembled when shelving books. She did not speak often about what had passed, nor did Rowena. But the two sisters walked more closely now, almost side by side, as if something unspoken had at last been acknowledged and, if not healed, at least shared. In the lane behind the vicarage, Mrs. Tillingham was seen planting primroses, muttering that the garden had become positively tragic looking. She did not mention the letters or the scandal, but every time she passed the post-box, she gave it a wary glance, as though expecting it might retaliate. And in her quiet, neatly trimmed cottage on Church Lane, Miss Marple returned to her everyday rhythms with that same gentle persistence that marked all her habits. Her garden flourished, particularly the sweet peas. She had taken to rising earlier, not out of worry, but to watch the village wake in its new skin. On a crisp Thursday morning, she hosted her knitting circle once again. The tea was perfectly steeped, the sponge cake light as ever. Mrs. Bantry arrived in a rather flamboyant hat. Miss Allerton brought a newly published book on watercolor techniques, and Kitty Price, still lingering in the village while waiting for a ship to Canada, was bursting with questions. "I still can't believe it was the vicar's wife," Kitty said, reaching for a second slice of cake. "She always seemed so proper." "They often do," Miss Marple said softly. "But poisoning," Kitty continued, as though determined to squeeze every drop from the scandal. "And the Inkblot letters were meant to be poetic or just dramatic." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward conspiratorially. "Jane thinks they were a form of intimidation, something the Colonel used when he was alive and Lillian copied after he was gone." "And the vicar? What of him?" asked Miss Allerton. "He still attends our guild meetings but says so little." "He's grieving," Miss Marple said. "Not only for his wife, for what her actions cost the village. And his own conscience, perhaps." There was a respectful silence. "But you saw it all," Kitty said, turning back to Miss Marple. "How did you know?" Miss Marple smiled faintly and reached for her knitting. "It was never just one thing," she said. "It was the timing, the pattern." Lillian's hands are always busy at the raffle table. Her gloves were mismatched on the morning after the party. The way she bristled when Cressida was mentioned was possessive, not maternal, and the fountain pen, which was never truly missing, only swapped. "Still," said Mrs. Bantry, "I'd never have guessed her. It's not in our nature to suspect people like Lillian." "It should be," Miss Marple said gently. "Not because we want to think ill of others, but because anyone is capable of terrible things under the right pressures. When fear and pride meet secrecy, even the most respectable become dangerous." They returned to their needles then, the room filled with the soothing click of yarn and the occasional laughter. Outside the window, a robin landed on the garden wall and bobbed its head cheerfully, unaware or unconcerned by the weighty truths these women had navigated. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a walk through the village. She passed by the post office, where Mrs. Tillingham gave a tight-lipped nod. She paused by the library, where Cressida looked up and smiled a genuine, if fragile, smile. She walked the length of the green, past the croquet pitch, now freshly raked and eerily quiet. Finally, she arrived at the churchyard. The colonel's grave had been tended by someone. A modest bouquet of white carnations lay atop the newly turned earth, tied with twine and no card. Miss Marple regarded it with an unreadable expression. She did not weep, she did not linger. Instead, she turned toward a smaller grave nearby, one marked by a simple stone and the name of a girl long gone from memory, save for Miss Marple's own. "People often ask how I notice things," she said quietly, as if to the stone, "but it's not about watching. It's about remembering what people are like when they think no one is." She stood there for a long moment, then straightened her coat and made her way back home. That evening, as dusk crept in like a velvet shawl, Miss Marple sat in her parlor, knitting by the fire. The radio played soft music from the BBC, the kind that lingers without demanding attention. Outside, the wind rustled the branches of the apple tree, and a fox barked in the distant fields. She sipped her tea, folded her knitting, and set it aside. Another secret had been untangled, another shadow gently drawn into light, and though the village would, in time, forget the details, the exact words of the letters, the expression on Lillian Harper's face as she was led away, the faint stain beneath the croquet lawn Jane Marple would not forget. Because such stories, she knew, were never isolated. They were part of something deeper, stitched into the very fabric of human nature. Wickedness did not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrived as a whisper, as an invitation marked with an inkblot, as a familiar face offering tea. And somewhere in the world, another village would one day come undone. But for now, Lower Chipping slept, and Miss Marple watched.